Hi, welcome back to week 3 of Intro to Cybersecurity. This week we're going to be looking at different topics along the lines of sanitizing output. Remember last week we talked about input and we looked at SQL injection as an example of code injection. Well, in this week's lab we'll be looking at another instance of code injection, and this is a much more popular and potentially damaging one called cross-site scripting. So for this lab we'll need to use burp, and you'll need to make sure that it's set up and running the same way that it was for the first week lab. One of the things that we're going to ask you to do first is to look at cookies in burp. Now, you may not be familiar with cookies, but a cookie is really just a generic name for a small packet of information that your browser will track about you, basically, and your usage of a website. A cookie could include something like the language that you prefer to use, or any kind of preference associated with the website. They are used very often in web development to track user preferences and specific information. And because of this, they can be abused. So one of the goals today will be getting familiar with cookies and what they look like to the browser. And you can really see them clearly in burp. So that's what the warm-up challenge is. Now, the rest of the challenges today look at cross-site scripting. And cookies are just one of the things that you will be able to access with cross-site scripting that you might not be able to access to. So remember last week we looked at SQL injection. And if you remember the basic pattern, you have a website with an input, and that input is meant to take in some ordinary value like name or address or something because it's connected to a database. But in a vulnerable scenario, the attacker might be able to supply a value that would actually get interpreted and executed by the database. So instead of being interpreted as a literal value by the database, the attacker would supply a string that would be interpreted as commands by the database and executed. Well, cross-site scripting is basically the same thing, except this time we're using JavaScript instead of SQL, and the target system is the browser itself instead of a back-end database. So in this scenario, an attacker will be supplying malicious JavaScript, usually in the form of a string that gets plugged into some kind of input, and the browser will interpret those as instructions rather than as data to pass back to the app. Now, there are a few different ways that this can manifest. There are a few different ways that you can use cross-site scripting to compromise a page. And for many of the kind of proofs of concept for a cross-site scripting exploit, it'll end with something simple like a browser alert popping up. So that might not seem like a very big deal that you can make a browser throw up a JavaScript alert. But if you can make a browser throw up a JavaScript alert, you can generally make it do a whole lot of other things that you shouldn't be able to do. And one of the things to keep in mind about cross-site scripting exploits is they are typically combined with other exploits that allow an attacker to gain much more complete access to a system. Maybe more than just breaking a site or making it do something that the attacker shouldn't be able to make it do. The cross-site scripting vulnerability might be used as part of what we call an attack chain to completely compromise the system and maybe even get direct access to the back end somehow. So a number of these might not seem like they are very severe vulnerabilities, but you do have to remember that they're often combined with others to really make for a more sophisticated attack. Go through the challenges in order, and remember challenges 5 and 6 are optional, and they will be a little bit more difficult, and you're not getting as much assistance on those, so prepare to kind of spend some more time figuring it out and anticipate that you'll have a little bit more difficulty with those. But those are the kinds of challenges in general that you want to work up to. You'll see as the labs go on, we try to include bonus optional challenges at the end of every lab that more accurately reflect what a real attacker might face. A scenario where the attacker might just have access to a page and might not know anything else and is just using some educated guesswork, trial and error to really find out what vulnerabilities are exposed and how they can be exploited. So try to work through all of them if you can, and don't get too frustrated. If you are spending too much time on any one, skip it and come back to it later after completing the others. Good luck.